Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rose. Good morning, everyone. It's so great to be speaking this morning in spite of everything that's going on in the nation at the moment. This morning, we're going to be looking at the book of Matthew chapter 2. And it's a well-known story, I think. You've probably heard about it before. It's the wise men visiting a new baby king, Jesus. And there are some other groups of characters as well that we'll meet in the story. There's this man called King Herod, and there's a group of religious leaders, of Jewish leaders. But before we get into that, I'd like to start by asking you a question. Can you think of a time in your life where you've been waiting for a long time for something that's really quite special, something really to look forward to? Perhaps it was a particular Christmas that you got really excited about, or a wedding. Perhaps like me, you just really cannot wait for the end of this pandemic so that we can get back to normality and start meeting in person again. Maybe at work, you were waiting for a promotion that you've been working hard for a really long time, and finally that day came. Or even just a special holiday that you were looking forward to. I wonder how you felt when that time finally came. I wonder what you did. Was it worth the wait? For me, I've got a particular example in mind in recent memory. But before I get into that, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself, a little bit of context. I'm Robin, as you know, and I love music. I really enjoy listening to music. I love playing music. I play a few different instruments. I love singing. I love doing sound at church on a Sunday, very much looking forward to doing that again this evening, and hopefully more next year. There's not been much opportunity this year, has there? And by extension, in addition to just loving music so much, I love musicals. I was in a few growing up. I really enjoyed them. One of my favorites was Joseph. I was in that one a few times. And when my wife and I got engaged, my wife Bethany, I took her to see The Lion King on her birthday shortly after we got engaged. And we had a great time, went down to London, truly wonderful experience. Cannot recommend that one enough. And then a few years ago, we had a friend come around, and he said, there's this new musical on Broadway called Hamilton. And you know, this has become a little bit of a phenomenon, so I'm sure many of you have heard about this musical now, but at the time we had not. And the soundtrack had just released on Spotify as an album, and so he introduced us to it, and we listened to a few songs with him, and we were instantly hooked. We listened to this album many times. We learned all of the words. We sang along in our house a lot of the time. We tried rapping. Bethany was better at the rapping than I was. We even found that it was the perfect length to drive down from our house in Nottingham, where we lived at the time, to my parents' house. We could listen to the whole album pretty much in that journey. It was perfectly timed. And so when we heard that the musical was coming to the West End, coming to London, we knew we had to buy tickets, and we did. And after a long time of waiting, we finally went down, and we drove down in the snow just 3 days before our first son was born. We would not let anything stop us seeing this musical. And boy, let me tell you, it was worth the wait. We had a great time. And again, I would highly recommend that musical. It was wonderful. And I can see Duncan's getting a little bit nervous. Robin's completely forgotten. He's giving a Christmas message. He's actually now just doing his musical top 10 list of all time, and you would not believe number 7. But let me backtrack then. Let me get back to the gospel. You see, in this story, we see a group of people, we see the Jewish leaders who have been waiting for centuries for the birth of the king. They've been waiting for such a long time, and the day has finally arrived. Jesus has been born. Surely this is the promised Messiah who they've been waiting for. He is the one who's going to set them free. He's going to give them new life. He's going to overthrow the Romans, right? He's going to restore a Jewish king to the throne of Israel. Well, let's see how they react. We're reading in Matthew chapter 2, as I said, and I'll be reading from verses 1 to 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler, who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. And as I said at the top, this is a set of verses, a passage that I'm sure is familiar to you. I'm sure you've heard it played out in many different forms each year as we approach Christmas time. And I talked a little about the different groups of people. And this message really is about a couple of things, but one of those things is how these different groups of people react to this king that has been born. The first verse introduces King Herod. You might have heard him referred to as Herod the Great. And we'll get to him in just a moment. But I first want to talk about this second group of people, the wise men from the East. Now, it's funny, we don't actually know an awful lot about them. They only appear in this one chapter of Matthew. But somehow there's a lot of historical baggage that we've attached to them over the years. We've decided that they weren't wise men, they were kings. And we know that there were three of them because of the number of gifts. And we've decided that we know their names as well. They were Balthazar and the other two. But Matthew doesn't say any of that. Matthew just says that they are wise men from the East. You might have heard of wise men or magi in the Old Testament. You might be thinking of the story of Daniel, where the wise men appear there and in the nation of Babylon at the time. So we've got some examples of what that looks like, but we don't know an awful lot. We do know that they were not local. They've traveled to get to Jerusalem, and they seem to have traveled far from the east, perhaps from Persia or indeed Babylon. And we know that they were not Jews. They did not follow the God of Abraham. They were pagans, they were Gentiles. But they do seem to have some knowledge of the Jewish law, enough to identify the rising star, and that it's a symbol of a new king to be born. But not enough, seemingly, to know that he was going to be born in Bethlehem. They went to Jerusalem. And they head off to Jerusalem, having seen this star. They pack their bags, and they go there as the reasonable place, to give them credit, the reasonable place to expect the baby king to be born, the king of the Jews. And when they arrive, they do not find what they expected. They find a different king. They find King Herod, and he is not best pleased. You see, as far as Herod is concerned, he is the king of the Jews, not this boy who's been born. And again, Herod is only mentioned briefly in the Bible, only in this one chapter of Matthew, same as the wise men. But he is slightly more well-documented figure of history, so we do know quite a lot about him. I don't want to go too much into a history lesson in this message, but he's quite an interesting character. Some things we know about him: he's appointed king in Judea by the Romans, by the Roman Senate, and that's where his power and authority comes from. And he's put in that position to keep that region, to keep Judah in line. And that's where he gets his title from. That's where he gets the title, the King of the Jews. So we can see why he's quite upset. We can understand when these men show up, these foreigners, these travelers show up looking for another King of the Jews. He's not very happy. And again, from history, we can learn that Herod was a paranoid man, a very jealous king. There are accounts of him having his brothers, one of his wives killed, and even some of his own sons executed, all so that he could retain his throne. He feared that these people were plotting against him and that he was going to lose that power that had been given to him. So his response then is not surprising. He gathers the religious leaders and he tries to figure out where exactly this boy will be born. He gathers the wise men and he tries to figure out when exactly the star rose so he can figure out when the boy was born. And he sends them off and tells them to return so that he can come and worship him. But we see that that is indeed not his intention. What he really wants is to stop, again, another perceived threat to his throne. And we see in the verses that follow where I stopped reading, he sends his armies and there is a slaughter of countless children in that attempt to retain his throne. So the response to Jesus is not what we would expect, perhaps, but for Herod, it seems to make sense. You see, Herod, as I said, is the king of the Jews, but Jesus also is the king of the Jews. And though they have this shared title, they could not be more different. We know that Herod came from a noble birth, but we read that Jesus was born to unmarried parents. We find that Herod is living in this palace in Jerusalem where we read in Matthew that Jesus is found in a humble house in Bethlehem. Herod is this picture of classical greatness, certainly for the time. He's got great power and authority, but Jesus, Matthew refers to in this passage, is just the child, hardly a picture of greatness. And finally, we find that the power and authority of Herod comes from the Romans. Whereas Jesus' power and authority, it comes from heaven. It comes from the fact that though he came into the world as a baby, though he came in weakness, as we were hearing earlier in our worship time, he came as Emmanuel. He came as God with us. He was still fully and completely God. And so Herod has every right to be troubled by this new king. He understands when he summons the religious leaders and they bring that prophecy, he understands what that means for him. And he understands that that leaves no place for a king like Herod. He fears the prophecies in the book of Daniel where it talks about one like the Son of Man who is coming. One like the Son of Man who is fully God, fully man, coming to take his rightful place on the throne of David. And we see in this prophecy that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, just as David was, the true heir to David's throne. What about the wise men then? Their response is very different. Their response is quite radical. You know, we don't know exactly where they're from. We've already touched on that, but it suggests that they made a very long journey. And it would have required preparation and it would have taken them a long time, all to go and see a baby king of a religion that they are not a part of. And they go to the palace in Jerusalem and they embark on this journey, even more impressive a journey than that 2-hour drive in the snow down to see Hamilton, and if I might say so, an even better thing at the end of that journey. They don't know where they're going. In fact, they go to the wrong place. They go to Jerusalem. They need correction from the religious leaders to point them in the right direction. But they do go. And they set off to find this king, and they come bearing gifts. And when they arrive, they bow down and worship him. So if this is the response of these non-Jewish travelers, then what about the religious leaders? What about the people who have been waiting for so long? When they hear of this new king's star that has been sighted, surely they would be just so excited to go in and find out and to see for themselves. These men who have been studying the prophets their whole lives, who on demand are able to quote Micah and tell Herod exactly where the baby will be born, who've no doubt read the countless prophecies in the Old Testament, in Numbers, in Samuel, in Isaiah, in Zechariah, in Daniel. This is what they have been waiting for. The time has finally come, and what do? Nothing. They do nothing. There's no further mention of them again in that chapter. The wise men journey on alone. They're given instructions to return when they found the boy. And we see the greatest failing in this chapter is of these religious leaders as they fail to go and see their king, as they reject Jesus. This reminds me of something we've been studying in our home group. So, we've been reading through the book of James, haven't we? And it reminds me of James chapter 3. What does James say about the value of faith without action, without works? He says that it is worthless, that it is dead. And it sounds really strong, doesn't it? Surely it's not that bad. Surely these wise men, not the wise men, these religious leaders are just being passive. What's the big deal? Well, we hear them referred to here in Matthew chapter 2 as the chief priests and the scribes. But we meet these groups of men again later on in the book of Matthew. You might have heard of them referred to as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. These same groups of men who reject Jesus as a baby, reject him later on as a grown man. They reject his teaching and they reject his works. And ultimately that rejection leads to his death, a rather painful death on the cross. You see, these same groups of people are found plotting together to have Jesus crucified. They're the ones who are shouting, "Crucify him," in front of Pilate. And as he hangs on a cross, he once again bears that title, the King of the Jews. So what went wrong? Where did it go wrong for these leaders? I believe they would have been loved to read the scriptures. They would have loved to worship what they perceived of God. They would have loved to worship the God of the past. And they dedicated their lives, as we've seen, to studying the prophets. They were able to quote them on demand. They loved to study the God of the future. But when it comes to the God of the present, and forgive me if this is sounding a bit like A Christmas Carol, a bit like Charles Dickens, then when it comes to the God of the present, they completely miss him. They ignore Jesus, they ignore Emmanuel, God with us, and they take him completely for granted. And I can see a little bit of this in my own heart. It can be so easy, can't it, to miss what God is doing right in front of us. I can certainly find that attitude in myself. For me, reading the Bible is great. I do enjoy reading the Bible. I enjoy learning truths about God. It builds me up. And I enjoy, it's great to look back at my life and look at all of the good things that God has done for me. It can also be great to look to the future, to read about God's promises for us. The Revelation series that we just finished was so helpful for that. And perhaps you have promises that God has spoken over your life, over your future, that you are looking forward to. But somehow when it comes to seeing what's in front of us, to seeing what God is doing in this moment, it can be really hard. And even more so in 2020, it's been such a tough year for many of us, and yesterday's news certainly hasn't helped that, has it? A couple of examples from my own life and from this year. In February, we had a second boy, a son called Ezra, and he was wonderful, and I had a few weeks of paternity leave to enjoy being with him, being with family. But not long after he was born, I barely got back to work. I was sent home to work from home full-time. There was lockdown coming for the whole country, and we were no longer able to see family and friends. My wife Bethany at home with the two boys, unable to get the support she needed. Home groups shutting down, going online, baby groups doing the same, and just finding ourselves in a really difficult time and praying to God, what is going on? Where are you? We've got family and friends who've never met our son. We've got family and friends who've missed out on so many precious moments now that he's almost a year old. And then similarly in summer, during the height of the Black Lives Matter protests and all that was going on there, and I'm sure you can remember, all of this systemic racism and injustice being brought to the forefront of the media that has been a problem for so long and continues to be a problem to this day. the corruption of various governments around the world being exposed, our own government completely mishandling various aspects of the pandemic, a lack of compassion around the world again, so many people in need, so many people losing out on homes, losing out on jobs, losing loved ones. You know, I've lost loved ones in my family. I've got friends who've lost their loved ones. And just finding a point again where I was praying out to God, God, what are you doing? Is this your plan for this year? Are these leaders that you have put in charge to various countries the right people? Are you sure? And you know, again, yesterday, you know, in a real low point after the news that we were changing completely our Christmas plans after the new government announcement. It can be so easy in those moments to lose what God is really doing, to lose sight of that. It might not be a literal savior being born in a nearby town, but God is still working. In my own life, for example, you know, we've been in lockdown, I've been working from home for the whole year, but my work has been so flexible. It's been really, really good. It's given parents the opportunity to work from home and to take time out of their day. You know, there was a long time over the summer where I had a couple of hours every morning just to spend time with my family. No need to make it back. I wasn't being paid any less. Just no, go and have some family time. Such a blessing for us. And then in church, we've had God speaking to us, even on Zoom. He's been speaking through different people. He's been healing people. He's bringing real joy and life to our meetings, even on Zoom and on YouTube. We've had countless new people join us this year. I'm sure even people on this call today I've seen on Zoom particularly. There are people here who were not with us before the pandemic. And you know, I believe some of those people would never have joined us in person, would never have been able to make it through that door at the community centre on a Sunday morning, but who are able to join us on Zoom or on YouTube because now we're just so much more accessible. God has really blessed us this year, despite and even through everything else that is going on around us. And you know what? These religious leaders, these chief priests and the scribes, they completely miss out. Just as we could if we're not careful. You see, had they travelled with the wise men, had they gone with them, perhaps they would have seen that Jesus, though he had the same title as Herod, though he was also called the King of the Jews, he could not have been more different. You know, the child born King of the Jews was not just that. It didn't stop there. He was a king of all nations. He was a hope and blessing to all, to every tribe, to every tongue. And he has put on weakness. He's become a baby, and he has put on weakness again at the cross when he submits to the Father. And through that act, he demonstrates a much greater love. He demonstrates that he is a much greater king than Herod could ever be, that any earthly king could ever be. He is the servant king, and his kingship is best displayed through love and self-sacrifice. You know, there's a biography about Herod that I will confess I've not read, but I like the title, and that's all that matters, right? The title. And it's called The King of the Jews, the Friend of the Romans. And we've seen that though Jesus was the King of the Jews, he was so much more. But given that the Romans were involved in crucifying him, he was hardly the friend of the Romans. So what was he? Who was he the friend to? Well, we read in Matthew's Gospel and the other Gospels that he is a friend of the marginalized. He's the friend of the oppressed, the neglected, the rejected. We read that he's the friend of children, of lepers, of cripples and beggars. We read that he is a friend of women, the friend of fishermen, friend of tax collectors, and the friend of prostitutes. Really, he's the friend of everyone that society has rejected. He's the friend of all people. And when Jesus is king, in his kingdom, all are welcome. Not just high society, not just the religious leaders, not just earthly kings, but people like you and me. People like the wise men. People like the shepherds. Not just Jews, not just high priests, all of us are welcomed in. And that's great news for everyone. Another thing we hear often at this time, and we heard reference to in the worship time, is the prophet Isaiah, when he talks about Jesus being called the Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Everlasting Father, isn't that such wonderful news, to have an everlasting Father? To be part of a family that is eternal. There's no chance of rejection or eviction from that family. We're promised love and blessing and joy for all time and for all eternity beyond measure. And, you know, we talk so much in Revelation Church about being family, following Jesus together. And this is what it's about. This is it right here. Being welcomed in all together into Jesus's family. You see, Herod was not like his subjects. He did not live life like they did. He came from a very noble and privileged birth and lived that way until his death. But Jesus, as we've seen, is totally different. He came in weakness. He came as a baby. He experienced life the way that we do. He experienced the most painful death on the cross for us. And so through that, he is really able to relate to us. He's really able to understand our weakness and our suffering. Our King, our Wonderful Counselor, really understands. He gets it. He gets us. He understands what it's like to live a human life, and he walks with us. I will end in prayer in just a minute, but let me just finish this message with this. What does the arrival of Jesus and his kingdom mean for us? It means the light of the world, as we've been hearing in our Christmas messages. It means the light of the world is finally here, and it is here to take on the kingdom of darkness. And let me let you in on a little secret. The kingdom of darkness cannot win. The kingdom of darkness, the reign of the enemy, the reign of sin and suffering, has had a hold on this world for far too long, and it stays unnumbered. The end of sickness and death is upon us. The darkness is no match for Jesus' kingdom, and the promised King is here. Hallelujah. Let me pray. Lord Jesus, I thank you so much for this passage. I thank you so much for the story of your birth. And I pray that even when we're finding it hard, you would help us to see what you are doing in the present. Help us to not miss out on you. Help us to engage in what you are doing. Help us to celebrate all that you've done, and help us to act to respond to you. You've given us so much blessing this year in spite of everything and through everything that's going on, Lord Jesus. I pray that you would help us to enjoy the remainder of the year. Help us to enjoy celebrating you in this carol, in this quiz, in this meeting that is to come. And I look forward to next year. I look forward to more encounters with you, Lord Jesus. I pray that you would be with us through every step and help us to see you working. Amen. Over to Rob. I think we're going to end in a song.